Senate. She's talked about some of the State of the Union from last night. Here's what she had to say.
I rise today to speak on behalf of my amendment to the proposed Keystone XL pipeline bill, and I want to thank Senators Bennett, Carper, Leahy, Menendez, Warren, and Whitehouse for co-sponsoring this amendment. Madam President, my amendment is extremely simple. It is about a page and a half, and I think it is easily understood by anyone who reads it. And this is what it says. Simple, straightforward. Quote, "It is the sense of Congress that Congress is in agreement with the opinion of virtually the entire worldwide scientific community that 1, climate change is real, 2, climate change is caused by human activities, 3, climate change has already caused devastating problems in the United States and around the world, 4, a brief window of opportunity exists before the United States and the entire planet suffer irreparable harm, and 5, it is imperative that the United States transform its energy system away from fossil fuels and toward energy efficiency and sustainable energy as rapidly as possible." Madam President, that's it. That is the entire amendment. And what this amendment does is simply ask the members of the United States Senate whether or not they agree with the overwhelming majority of scientists who have told us over and over and over again that climate change is real, that climate change is caused by human activity, including the emission of carbon, that climate change is already causing devastating problems in the United States and around the world, and that if we are going to leave our children and our grandchildren a planet that is habitable, we must transform our energy system away from fossil fuel. Madam President, progressives and conservatives and people in between have many, many disagreements on issues, and that is called democracy, and there is nothing to be ashamed about that. That is the democratic process. We all have differences of opinion. But what is not a good thing is when we make public policy in contradiction to what the scientific community tells us. That is not a good thing. When we look at issues, medical issues like cancer or heart disease, what we do is look at the scientific communities and medical doctors for their opinions as to how we should proceed. When we look at infrastructure issues, the issues of roads and bridges, we look at engineers for their opinion as to how we should proceed. When we look at education and trying to understand how kids can best learn, we look at educators and those people who know most about education for advice as to how we should proceed. And in terms of the issue of climate change, the process should not be any different. Madam President, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is the leading scientific body that deals with the issue of climate change. And let me very briefly quote to you what the IPCC said last fall, and I quote, "Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evident from observations of increases in global average air and ocean temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, and rising global average sea level." End of quote. Madam President, more than 97% of the scientific community in the United States and across the globe agrees with these findings, including the American Chemical Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Meteorological Society, and the American Geophysical Union, to name just a few. In fact, at least 37 American scientific organizations 135 international scientific organizations and national academies of science, and 21 medical associations all agree that climate change is real and is significantly caused by human activities. Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent to submit into the record the names of 37 American scientific organizations, 135 international scientific organizations and national academies, and 21 medical associations who all have gone on record as stating that climate change is real and is significantly caused by human activity.
Without objection.
Madam President, I know that recently a number of my colleagues have made the point that they are not scientists and they can't formulate an opinion on this subject. Well, let me be very clear. I am not a scientist. Had a lot of problems with physics when I was in college. I am not a scientist. But these are scientists. These are 37 American scientific organizations and 135 international scientific organizations. These are scientists who tell us that climate change is real, it is caused by human activity, and that it is imperative that we transform our energy system away from fossil fuel. Madam President, let me read to you an excerpt of a letter signed by virtually every major scientific organization in this country, sent to the Senate way back in 2009. Quote, observations throughout the world make it clear that climate change is occurring, and rigorous scientific research demonstrates that the greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are the primary driver. These conclusions are based on multiple independent lines of evidence, and contrary assertions are inconsistent with an objective assessment of the vast body of peer-reviewed science. Moreover, there is strong evidence that ongoing climate change will have broad impacts on society, including the global economy and on the environment. For the United States, climate change impacts include sea level rise for coastal states, greater threats of extreme weather events, and increased risk of regional water scarcity, urban heat waves, western wildfires, and a disturbance of biological systems throughout the country. The severity of climate change impacts is expected to increase substantially in the coming years. Once again, Madam President, I am not a scientist, but that is what the scientific community overwhelmingly in the United States and around the world is saying. It is imperative that the United States Senate goes on record in saying we agree with science. Madam President, climate change is one of the great threats facing our country and the entire planet. It has the capability of causing severe harm to our economy, to our food supply, to access to water, and to national security. And according to NASA and NOAA, 2014 was the warmest year ever recorded. The most recent decade was the nation's warmest on record. Across the globe, the 10 warmest years on record have all occurred since 1997. We know that the Earth's climate is warming and doing so quickly. According to NOAA, October, August, June, and May were the hottest October, August, June, and May months ever recorded. The consequence of this rapid and dramatic rise in global temperatures will have a profound impact on billions of people throughout the world. What we can expect are more severe weather disturbances, more flooding, more heat waves, more droughts, more forest fires, and saltwater inundation of water supplies and agricultural land. As the New York Times reported in August, droughts in the western and southwestern U.S. appear to be intensifying as a result of climate change. Quote, over the past decade, Droughts in some regions have rivaled the epic dry spells of the 1930s and 1950s. The country is in the midst of one of the most sustained periods of increasing drought on record. China's heat wave a year and a half ago was the worst in at least 140 years. As Climate Wire reported in November, the Sao Paulo region in Brazil is suffering from its worst drought in 80 years. In the United States, fire suppression costs have increased from roughly $1 billion annually in the mid-1990s to an average of more than $3 billion in the past 5 years. And our oceans are not just getting warmer, they are also becoming more acidic, threatening fish, coral reefs, and other sea life. As a study published in the journal Science reported, carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere are driving a rate of change in ocean acidity that is already thought to be faster than in any time in the past 50 million years. The authors warned that we may be, quote, entering an unknown territory of marine ecosystem change, end of quote. Extreme storms, weather disturbances, are also becoming more common and more intense, with extraordinary impacts. For example, when Typhoon Haiyan struck the Philippines a year ago, it displaced over 4 million people, killed thousands, and cost that country at least $15 billion in damages. Madam President, the situation clearly is bad today in the United States and around the world, but according to the scientific community, if we do not get our act together, if we do not cut carbon emissions, it will only get worse in years to come. The IPCC estimates, and I hope people listen to this, the IPCC estimates that without any additional efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, in other words, if we continue to go along our merry old way of dependency on fossil fuels, I quote, warming is more likely than not to exceed 4 degrees Celsius, that is 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit, by the end of the century, end quote. Let me repeat that extraordinary observation. If we continue along our present course, quote, warming is more likely than not to exceed 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, end of quote. Similarly, just last year, the White House released the National Climate Assessment, warning that global warming could exceed 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the United States by the end of the century. Just take a deep breath and imagine what it will mean to this country, the huge impact on every aspect of our life, on our economy, on agriculture, on health, if the temperature of the United States rises, as some are predicting, by 10 degrees Fahrenheit at the end of the century. It is almost unthinkable. And that is what the scientific community is telling us. The World Bank is by no means a radical institution. It is a very conservative institution. And it tells us that temperature increases by even just 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit would bring about unprecedented heat waves, severe drought, and major floods in many regions with serious impacts on human systems, ecosystems, and associated services. The IPCC reports that sea levels are likely to rise by another 10 to 32 inches by the end of this century. As the New York Times reported, a sea level rise of less than 4 feet would inundate land on which some 3.7 million Americans live today. We're talking about Miami. We're talking about New Orleans. We're talking about New York City. We are talking about Boston, all being highly vulnerable to rising sea levels. Similarly, of course, this problem will impact people all over the world. According to the IPCC, and I quote, many small island nations are only a few meters above present sea level. These states may face serious threat of permanent inundation from sea level rise. Among the most vulnerable of these island states are the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tonga, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Cook Islands. Madam President, the Army Corps of Engineers have predicted that the entire village of Newtok, Alaska, could be underwater by 2017, and that more than 180 additional native Alaskan villages are at risk. Parts of Alaska, one of our great and beautiful states, are already vanishing as a result of climate change. Madam President, the evidence is overwhelming, and it is no longer good enough for people to say, I'm not a scientist, I don't know. We may not be scientists, but we can read and we can listen to what the overwhelming majority of scientists are telling us. That's our job, to listen to the experts who know something about this issue. Now, as we debate the Keystone Pipeline, what disturbs me very much is that in the face of this overwhelming evidence from the scientific community, in the face of deep concerns about climate change all over the world, what is the United States Senate going to be doing in the next week or two as part of Keystone Pipeline? Are we going to be voting to impose a tax on carbon so that we can break our dependence on fossil fuel? Is that what we are going to be voting on? No, I don't think so. Are we going to be voting to pass legislation that moves us aggressively toward energy efficiency and weatherization and such sustainable energies as wind, solar, and geothermal? Is that what we're going to be voting on as we listen to the scientific community? No, I don't think so. Are we going to be passing a bill investing in research and development so that we can make our transportation system more energy efficient? Is that what we're going to be voting on? No, we're not. In fact, what we are going to be voting on is a bill that will allow for an increase in the production and transportation of some of the dirtiest oil on this planet. That is what we are voting on. What we are voting on is a proposal which moves us in exactly the opposite direction from what the scientific community wants us to do. So, Madam President, let me just conclude by saying this. Honest people can and do have disagreements on many, many issues. But it is not a good thing for the United States of America when we reject what the scientists and the experts are telling us. That is not a good thing. So I hope very much that the amendment that I have brought forth, which says nothing more than listen to the scientists on this important issue, do not reject science, I hope very much that we can get widespread bipartisan support for this amendment. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.